Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're talking about the 2007 album from Amon Tobin, Foley Room. Alright, getting back to discussing the evolution of Amon Tobin. With albums like Out From Out Where and Chaos Theory, he'd been moving away from sampling old vinyl records and more towards recreating the same vibe out of live instrumental performances and processed versions thereof. But this album in 2007 marked an even further new development for him and his sound design. No longer was he content with deconstructing his usual vibe out of live instrumentation. He wanted to go even further with his experiments into found sound recordings. The album title is a pretty literal description of his mission this time around, making use of the kind of recording chambers that movie studios use to record sound effects. Obviously better known as Foley rooms. He also headed out in the streets to record even more sound effects, and the sources he used could be literally anything. Going off the Bandcamp description, some sources include tigers roaring, cats eating rats, wasps buzzing, falling chickpeas, kitchen utensils, motorbikes, and water dripping from a faucet, just to name a few. Guy went full Matmos on this one. Although he did still include guest musicians playing actual instruments as well, including the Kronos Quartet, harpist Sarah Paget, Patrick Watson, KJ Saka of Pendulum fame, and Stefan Schneider of Tu Rococo Rot, among many others. Sound design-wise, it was his most elaborate work yet. Some physical versions also include a DVD that has a mini documentary going through his recording process, which I have not watched. According to Tobin, he'd seen a bit of a disconnect between music that was purely based around sound design and music that was actually trying to form coherent tunes that can move people, and he was trying to bridge that gap with this album, make something that could excite people but made using methods that would otherwise be associated with academic studies and the like. Whether or not he succeeded in that, he couldn't say, but it was his goal at least. Now, this album did continue his impressive track record of critical hits and got pretty universal acclaim by all the usual outlets and his core fan base. I don't think you can call this one like an unfairly overlooked gem in his catalog. Although, I will admit, I almost never see people calling this their favorite of all his albums. I mean, I'm sure I'll see those people showing up in the comments. Yeah, I mean, you'll hardly ever see people express negative-leaning feelings towards this one. He certainly wasn't going so far out there as to alienate his core fan base. Yet. But it doesn't command the same level of enthusiasm that albums like Permutation, Super Modified, or Out From Out Where do. All the reviews tend to be around like the 7 and 8 out of 10 range, and the general consensus seems to be that while it's really cool, it's more middle tier by his usual standards. And that's kind of around where I've come to sit with this as well. Tobin may have talked about his mission to bridge the gap between creating an exciting and accessible listening experience and getting there through much more unconventional and academic methods of recording. Though while he certainly succeeded at making such an unconventional blend of sounds come together in a way that sounded distinctly like an Amon Tobin album, in focusing so hard on the sound design, I do feel like he was moving further and further away from his tracks actually having memorable hooks. I've listened to this album a lot of times in preparation for this video, and a surprising amount of these listens fell into the background for me. Now, it's not his worst in that department. The lack of hooks was also probably the biggest issue I had with Chaos Theory, and this album is definitely way better and less samey or background music-y than that album. The sound design here is often striking and out of the box enough for that to be what makes tracks stand out among the track listing in some moments. It was an album I was always consistently impressed by anytime I put it on, and I do feel like the hits outweigh the misses, but it also wasn't necessarily the kind of thing that I was, like, dying to come back to after it was done. I feel like I got kind of a similar fatigued feeling out of putting this on repeatedly that I did with Super Modified. At less pronounced extent, I think, but still definitely there. So let's break this thing down by individual tracks. The album starts out with Bloodstone, a track with all these aching and dissonant string sections carry the Kronos Quartet, as well as lots of old-timey pianos and some organs here and there, evoking imagery of some kind of miserable setting from like 100 years ago, the kind of thing that you would imagine soundtracking a documentary about like the influenza outbreak of 1918 or something. Although the second half brings in a lot more of Tobin's trademark heavy drum breaks, you can hear some of the various metal objects he assembled that break out of although the actual groove they form is pretty off-kilter, and I wouldn't necessarily call all that propulsive or driving forward momentum. I'm really conflicted on this one, because this is one of those tracks that I initially really liked, and was fully expecting to mark as one of the biggest highlights. It is certainly one of the album's most memorable moments, but it also grew off me the more times I listened to it. It is an effectively attention-grabbing and, semi-indicative opener, but it does also have more the feel of like an album intro than a point at which things really start to get going. Also, the longer I immersed myself in the especially sickly tone of it, the more it started to get a bit too effective at making me feel kind of drained and sick myself. It does succeed at what it's going for, just, not one of the tracks I most enjoy coming back to, I guess. Though I guess the crescendo that the intro starts is even further escalated by the next track, Esther's, which initially picks up directly from where the opener left off, bringing in even more old-timey pianos, but this time paying that off to a much more actually propulsive drop that sounds built out of lots of aggressive pads of like car and motorcycle engine revving, and a beat which has like, I guess these tambourine-like sounds that I think come from like rattling a metal chain or something. So that's a banger. I feel like this is where the album really starts to pick up, even though the transition between it and Bloodstone also feels pretty seamless. And speaking of bangers, next you got Keep Your Distance, which keeps up the same kind of aggressive spy movie vibes as you'd expect, through some clean electric guitar licks, foreboding bass, whistling pads that sound like tea kettles or train whistles going off, but meant to imitate movie soundtrack strings, and a clatteringly off-kilter selection of percussion that sounds like it was built out of all manner of pots and pans and silverware. Even starts really building up in the second half and maybe bringing in some samba influences in the way the percussion sounds are assembled, though some processed guitars come back in for the outro to give the mix a little more warmth, so that one's really good. From there you got The Killer's Vanilla, which could have easily passed as a track from Out Where's track listing in how most of the instrumentation sounds more traditional in its source. Don't know if it actually is, but, the blend of Hammond-style organs, harshly dramatic string sections, and hip-hop-style drum breaks of two different intensity levels depending on which half of the track you're in, all of it sticks pretty firmly to the kind of sound you'd expect out of, most other Amon Tobin productions from the 2000s, and it's pretty badass, as to be expected. I don't know if it necessarily would have been one of my favorite tracks had it been included on Out Where. In many of my earlier listens of the album, this one fell in the background pretty easily, but at least in contrast to Bloodstone, which started out great and wore out on me the more times I heard it, this one slowly grew on me the more times I heard it. I think I can pretty comfortably call it a highlight now. Anyway, a much more attention-grabbing moment for this album is the next track, Kitchen Sink. Of course, an album advertised directly on the diversity of its found sound sources is going to have to sample a kitchen sink eventually just to contradict the common figure of speech. It has everything including kitchen sink. But putting the cheap joke aside, boy does he deliver on the premise of naming a track Kitchen Sink, sampling all sorts of water splashes and drips and pipes and squeaks in patterns that vaguely resemble like an early UK dubstep from that era. There's very little melody to the track, but it's one of the most obvious go-to moments to highlight when talking about how this album's sound design is the main thing carrying the experience. It's probably the most Matt Mosey of moments on this thing. Little bit of Ultimate Care 2 energy to it. Though next we have the track Horsefish. A 5-minute track almost entirely based around rapidly plucked harp performances of Sarah Paget, with no beat work at all. And I'm gonna be honest, this is right around the point where the album most frequently loses my attention altogether. Now, this track is still very nice at worst. There's some digressions into twangy western movie guitars and some humming wordless vocals, some occasional string washes that remind me a lot of what he did on the track Searchers from Out Where, albeit markedly less catchy than that. But for the most part, it's just kind of a mildly unnerving mood piece that blends a little too well into the surrounding moments without providing a striking enough idea that really sticks out to me. I feel like the general idea and vibe behind this track would be significantly improved upon by pretty much the entirety of his Fear and a Handful of Dust album 12 years later. There's also the title track right after that, which certainly has a lot more energy and doesn't feel like it's dropping the pacing, though I kind of feel like it's reprising ideas that were done better elsewhere on earlier tracks on the album, especially Keep Your Distance. The pots and pans and empty dumpster banging percussion workouts in here are still cool and somehow manage to retain like a jazzy flair that is as recognizably Tobin's work as always. At one point turning what sounds like dragging a PVC pipe across a street into something that sounds like a crazy drum solo is pretty inspired when you notice what's going on there. But in the overall context of the album, this track does feel a little on the redundant side. What is a much easier track to notice in context, however, is the next track, Big Furry Head, a track that also adheres to something of a classic 2000s dubstep framework, but where dubstep might be known for like the growling timbre of bass it uses sometimes, Tobin decides to take that much more literally and sample the actual growling and grunting of animals here, juxtaposing that against more, unnerving harp-plucking and weird metal twanging noises. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily call this track a highlight per se. The mix is more sparse and empty feeling in comparison with other tracks here. There's not really much of a tune either, but I can't say the track ever passes by without me noticing. Those tiger growls and or pig grunts or whatever animals those come from are pretty impossible to miss. I don't know if I would say it's a track that I actively look forward to, but it's also not one that I think the album would be able to do as well without. Not to mention the kind of thing that's feels very much unique to this specific album. I mean, a lot of other tracks here explore ideas that I think other albums of his, both earlier and later, would go deeper on. But a track like this is pretty specific to the kind of experience that only this album can deliver, and I have to respect it for that. Anyway, as we get closer to the end of the album, he starts bringing back some more of the approaches that he explored in the beginning of the albums, and my attention starts to get pulled back in. Ever Falling has the most of an actual tune to it out of any track here since The Killer's Vanilla, and actually sounds pretty similar to that track in particular, especially in the way it utilizes organs in many parts. Though the off-kilter guitar chops and wordless vocal choruses in the background make this track feel sufficiently distinct from that one. But there's even more of a distinct hook to the next track, Always, which even has actual singing in it. Fairly quiet and childlike falsetto singing that gets buried in seas of percussion, but, singing nonetheless. And the way it goes up against the crashing breaks, spy guitar riffs, and snippets of string sections make this once again feel more like something that could have fit at home on one of Tobin's earlier classic albums. It didn't stand out to me on my first couple of listens, but cemented itself as one of my favorites the more times I heard it. And then we hit Straight Psyche, the album's longest cut at a little under 7 minutes. It's another one of the album's slower and quieter moments, not unlike Horsefish. Although, I do like this track more than that one. The guitar riffs have more of a coherent tune when they are appearing. The beat work, which sounds like shuffling around shopping carts or something, gives this a bit more of a pulse. The random digressions into IDM-inspired workouts, or mysterious chiming ambience, or creepy pianos, all adds up to something decently immersive. I wouldn't say it's a track that ever stuck out to me as among my biggest favorites, or really got me to turn my head at it, but all the ideas here are well executed enough where I don't feel like complaining about it. It's a very solid track. Though as nice as all of this stuff has been, if there's going to be any track on this album I'm most likely to remember longer term, it's almost certainly going to be the closing track, At the End of the Day. I don't know what it is about this track in particular, but that pattern of rapid guitar plucks and fluttery electric pianos is catchier than any other melodic motif on the entire album, and the way it's built up in the standard Amon Tobin mix of crashing and imposing drum breaks and dramatic movie soundtrack string sections make this a major home run of a finish to the whole project, even if one that feels pretty familiar to plenty of sounds he's already explored before. If this had been on Out From Out Where, it still would have been a highlight on that album as well. So yeah, that's everything on Foley Room. Man, I don't know what happened with me in this album. I went in really hoping to go to bat for this one as like a big underrated gem in his catalog on the merit of the core idea behind it, of creatively assembling everything together out of field recordings, and how uniquely the sound design and execution of all of it comes together. There was definitely a point at which this was like my third favorite of his albums behind the two obvious ones. But the more times I put it on in preparation for this video, the less enthusiasm I felt and the less I looked forward to actually trying to write the script. And I think at the end of it all, I came out with almost the exact same feelings on this that I have to Super Modified. Feeling that it's mostly a transitional effort and kind of a mixed bag. Now, I do think I ever so slightly prefer this album over Super Modified, out of finding this to be a little more consistent. Even my least favorite moments on this album still have like an odd, out-of-the-box creative flair to them that can keep me interested in a way that my least favorite moments on Super Modified can't to the same degree. The low-energy meandering of a track like Horsefish still has more emotional resonance for me than, say, Rhino Jockey, or is easier to sit through than the wet beatboxing on Precursor. Foley Room doesn't have any tracks that turn me off to the point of being skips. But also, Super Modified's high points were way higher than the high points on this album. And I mean tracks like Esther's, Kitchen Sink, Always, and At the End of the Day may be no slouches, but none of these even really approach the same heights as a 4-ton Mantis or even a Natureland. The best tracks here are more in like the same tier as Chocolate Lovely and Dio and that kind of thing. So yeah, at the end of the day, no pun intended, this album is still really good, and I do think there's a very specific experience that you can only get out of this album and no others in existence. You certainly cannot say the guy wasn't taking risks or pushing himself hard enough. But once you get past the novelty of the concept, the tracks themselves kind of sit in this awkward middle ground between the style of his earlier records, which it felt like he was actively starting to grow tired of, and the style of his later records where he would push himself even further out of his comfort zone and eventually redefine what one could even expect out of an Amon Tobin album to begin with. This is the first point at which you can, like, really obviously hear the DNA of the sounds he would explore in, like, his No Mark Records comeback era. Now, obviously not to write off this album's concept as a mere novelty. I do think that, like, the whole Foley Room found sound thing could also make this stuff easier to recommend than many of the No Mark era stuff. Because, again, you're never gonna hear another Kitchen Sink or Big Furry Head out of him after this. But knowing the impressiveness of what he would accomplish afterwards, this by comparison can feel like a mere taster of what he would be delivering later. Especially compared to what he did on his next album. But in the meantime, I've landed on this album being very good, very close to great, but I think it comes up a tiny bit short of crossing that threshold of me properly loving it. I'd say it is, again, more of a middle-tier work for him rather than one of his absolute best, and as such, I'm overall feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.